In the cold green hush of Minnesota's North Woods, Jedediah Jed Stone was a man carved from the very landscape he inhabited. But after a vicious late-season blizzard muffled the world in white, he heard a sound he couldn't ignore. A thin, reedy cry piercing the profound silence. Under a snow-laden bough, he found a half-frozen creature, no bigger than his gloved hand. It was the most peculiar kitten he had ever seen, with paws far too big for its body and tiny dark tufts at the tips of its ears. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the forest, Jed broke his own rule, scooping up the sorry sight and tucking it against his chest. He named him Ruckus. Ruckus grew, and grew, and grew. The tiny shivering kitten with the voracious appetite soon became a gangly 40-pound adolescent, and then a formidable 60-pound predator. With a fatal flaw. He had the body of a hunter, but the soul of a clumsy kitten. What Jed couldn't know was that the strange little creature in his arms wasn't just a cat. It was a miracle nature never meant to exist. Dr. Eris Thorne had seen just about everything in his 30 years running the North Woods Wildlife Haven. He'd rehabilitated eagles with shattered wings, nursed orphan bear cubs back to health, and even once had to figure out how to treat a moose with a toothache. His life, nestled in the sprawling forests of northern Minnesota, was a testament to the resilience and wildness of nature. But nothing, in all his years, had prepared him for the creature currently lounging in the sun-drenched corner of the sanctuary's largest enclosure. From a distance, he looked like a myth made real. He possessed the powerful muscular haunches and the distinct spotted markings of a bobcat, but on a scale that defied belief. His body was enormous, a solid mass of muscle that tipped the scales at a staggering 88 pounds. His paws were the size of dinner plates, and his ears were crowned with the long, elegant black tufts of a Canadian lynx. He was a Blinx, an impossibly rare hybrid, a genetic fluke that had combined the formidable traits of two of the North Woods' most elusive predators into one majestic, awe-inspiring package. Any other animal of his size and lineage would be a fearsome sight, an apex predator demanding respect and a wide berth. But as Eris watched, the giant cat rolled onto his back, exposing a spotted, vulnerable belly to the sky. He let out a soft, chirping sound, less a growl and more a query, and began batting at a dandelion fluff drifting on the breeze. His movements were not those of a wild hunter, but of an oversized, slightly clumsy kitten. This was Blobby, and his story was as improbable as his existence. The story began not at the sanctuary, but 50 miles north, on a patch of rugged land owned by a man as weathered and stubborn as the ancient pines that grew there. Jedediah Jed Stone was a man carved from the very landscape he inhabited. His face was a road map of wrinkles etched by 70-odd years of harsh winters and blistering summer suns. He lived a life of quiet solitude, his only companions the deer that nibbled at his vegetable garden and the grumpy blue jays that scolded him from the branches of his oak tree. It was late April, a time of cruel deception in Minnesota. The sun could shine with the promise of spring one moment, only for a bitter late-season blizzard to sweep in the next. It was on the heels of such a storm that Jed, bundled in a flannel-lined canvas jacket, was checking the fence line that bordered the vast expanse of the Superior National Forest. The snow had been heavy and wet, and he was looking for fallen branches or downed wires. The air was sharp and still, the world muffled by a fresh white blanket. That's when he heard it. It was a sound so faint he almost dismissed it as the wind whistling through a knot in a dead tree. A thin, reedy cry, filled with a desperate, hopeless energy. Jed stopped, his breath misting in the frigid air, and listened. There it was again, a tiny needle of sound piercing the profound silence. It was the sound of a kitten. Jed wasn't a man given to sentimentality, but he wasn't cruel either. He knew the brutal calculus of the wild. A kitten, alone after a storm like this, was already a ghost. Still, something compelled him to move. He trudged through the snow, his old knees aching in protest, following the pathetic mews. He found the source under a snow-laden fir bough, huddled against the trunk. It was the most peculiar-looking kitten he had ever seen. It was tiny, no bigger than his gloved hand, and shivering violently. Its fur was a matted mess of brown and gray, with faint shadowy spots. Its paws seemed too big for its body, and its ears, even at this minuscule size, had tiny, dark tufts at their tips. It was half-frozen and barely breathing. Of its mother or any siblings, there was no sign. A track line of a large feline, a lynx by the size of the prince, led away from the spot, but it was alone, with no returning tracks. Perhaps the mother had been spooked, or perhaps, in the brutal triage of nature, she had abandoned a strange, anomalous baby to its fate. Jed grumbled to himself, "Well, ain't you a sorry sight?" He knew the rules. You don't interfere. Nature has its own harsh but necessary logic. Taking it in would be a mistake. It was a wild animal. But as he looked at the trembling, near-lifeless ball of fur, he saw not a wild animal, but a creature on the brink of oblivion. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the whole forest, he gently scooped the kitten up, tucking it inside his jacket against the warmth of his chest. "All right, you little ruckus," he muttered, the name coming to him unbidden. "Let's see if we can't cheat the Reaper just this once." The first 48 hours were a delicate dance with death. Jed, a man more comfortable with fixing tractor engines than nurturing a fragile life, became a reluctant nursemaid. He used an eyedropper to feed the kitten a formula he'd bought at the feed store, a few precious drops at a time. He made a bed for it in a cardboard box lined with his old wool sweaters, placing it near the comforting warmth of his wood-burning stove. He'd wake in the middle of the night to the sound of its weak cries and would patiently administer another feeding, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle. Slowly, miraculously, the kitten began to rally. Its shivering subsided, replaced by a faint, rumbling purr whenever Jed stroked its head. Its eyes, a startling shade of blue-gray, began to focus. It started to move, exploring the confines of its box with a clumsy, wobbling gait. Jed would watch, a rare, small smile touching his lips. The silence of his cabin was no longer absolute. It was punctuated by the soft sounds of a tiny life he had pulled back from the edge. As the days turned into weeks, Ruckus grew, and grew, and grew. Jed had raised barn cats before, but this was something else entirely. The kitten's appetite was voracious. His paws, which had seemed comically large, were now growing into his body, which was elongating at an alarming rate. The faint spots on his coat became more defined, and the ear tufts became more prominent. He was a whirlwind of kitten energy, but with none of the predatory grace Jed had seen in other wild felines. His hunting instincts were hilariously miscalibrated. He would stalk a dust bunny with the intensity of a tiger, wiggling his hindquarters before launching into a pounce that was more of a clumsy tumble. He'd capture Jed's leather work boots, wrestling them with a ferocity that was entirely for show, his attacks punctuated by soft, playful growls. He never used his claws. His favorite toy was a red flannel scrap tied to a string. Jed would drag it across the wooden floor, and the not-so-little cat would chase it with uncoordinated glee, his oversized paws skidding on the polished boards. When he caught it, he wouldn't shred it. He'd simply hold it in his mouth, purring his ridiculously loud purr, and look up at Jed with an expression of pure, simple joy. By the time summer was in full swing, Ruckus was no longer a kitten. He was an adolescent, a gangly, awkward creature weighing nearly 40 pounds. He was all legs and paws, still growing into a frame that promised immense size. Jed's small cabin was beginning to feel even smaller. Ruckus would try to curl up on Jed's lap in the evenings as he read the paper, oblivious to the fact that he no longer fit, his limbs spilling over the sides of the armchair. Jed knew he had a problem. This was not a house cat. He couldn't let him outside. The cat had no fear of anything and showed no ability to fend for himself. He was utterly dependent on the old man who had saved him. The love Jed felt for the creature was a deep, quiet thing, an unexpected warmth in the twilight of his life. But it was a love tangled with worry. What would happen to Ruckus if something happened to him? The breaking point came one afternoon in the fall. Jed was splitting firewood when Ruckus, now a formidable 60 pounds of sleek muscle, decided to help. He stalked one of the log rounds, batted it gently with a paw the size of a small skull, then looked at Jed, chirping expectantly as if waiting for praise. A deer and her fawn, frequent visitors, appeared at the edge of the clearing. A true predator would have frozen, every muscle coiled for the hunt. Ruckus looked at them, blinked slowly, and then went back to batting his log. Jed put down his axe, his heart heavy. This magnificent animal, a genetic marvel of predatory power, had the soul of a kitten. He was a masterpiece of nature with a fatal flaw. He didn't know what he was. Keeping him here was selfish. It wasn't a life. With a sense of dread, Jed went inside and looked up the number for the North Woods Wildlife Haven. Dr. Eris Thorne remembered the phone call vividly. The old man's voice was gravelly, hesitant. He spoke of a cat he'd found, a big fella, that he couldn't care for anymore. Eris had heard calls like this 100 times. Usually it was a raccoon someone had foolishly tried to domesticate, or, at most, an actual bobcat kitten that was now a snarling, unmanageable adolescent. He agreed to drive out, expecting a routine, if slightly sad, pickup. When Jed opened the cabin door, Eris was greeted by the sight of a grizzled old man and something else. Behind him, a massive feline head peeked around the doorframe. Its eyes were wide with curiosity, and its tufted ears swiveled to track Eris's every move. It was bigger than any bobcat Eris had ever seen, and its markings were a strange, beautiful blend of a bobcat's rosettes and a lynx's more subtle spotting. "That's him. That's Ruckus," Jed said, his voice thick with emotion. Eris stepped inside, his mind racing. He moved slowly, cautiously. An animal of this size, cornered in a small space, could be incredibly dangerous. But the cat didn't hiss or growl. It padded forward, its movements surprisingly light for its size, and sniffed at Eris's outstretched, non-threatening hand. Then it did something that stunned the veteran biologist. It leaned in and rubbed its giant head against his leg, letting out a purr that vibrated through the floorboards. It sounded like a well-tuned outboard motor. Eris looked from the cat to the old man. "My word," he breathed. "What is he?" "Don't rightly know," Jed admitted. "Just know he ain't fit for the wild. He thinks he's a house cat." The transfer was one of the hardest things Jed had ever done. Ruckus, now officially identified by Eris as a probable Blinks hybrid, was confused by the transport crate. He wouldn't go in until Jed put his old, worn-out sweater inside. As Aris and his team loaded the crate onto the truck, Ruckus let out a series of distressed, chirping mews. Jed stood by his cabin door, his face a mask of stoicism, but Aris saw the glint of tears in the old man's eyes. Back at the sanctuary, the new arrival was the talk of the staff. They marveled at his size and his shockingly docile nature. He was given the largest, most secure enclosure, complete with climbing structures, a small pool, and plenty of shady spots. He spent the first few days hiding, confused and lonely. The staff gave him his space, leaving food and water, speaking to him in low, soothing tones. It was a young, enthusiastic keeper named Maya who finally broke the ice. She noticed he wasn't eating much. Remembering what Jet had said, she brought in an old flannel shirt from the lost and found. She sat just outside the enclosure, talking to him, and tossed the shirt into a sunny spot. The big cat crept out of his den, sniffed the shirt, and then, with a great sigh, flopped down onto it, rolling around like a kitten in catnip. He started eating that evening. They decided a new name was in order for his new life. Ruckus didn't seem to fit his gentle spirit. It was during a play session that the perfect name emerged. Maya was using a long pole with a bundle of feathers tied to the end. The giant cat, now approaching 80 pounds, would chase it with abandon. But his pounces were still comically clumsy. He'd leap into the air and land with a soft, heavy thump, more like a beanbag than a predator. "He's like a big, lovable blob," Maya laughed one day after he'd performed a particularly ungraceful somersault. And the name stuck. He became Blobby. Despite his gentle nature, the sanctuary's primary goal was always rehabilitation and release. Aris and his team had to know for sure if Blobby could survive on his own. They began a series of carefully controlled tests. The first test involved a live rabbit placed in a special sectioned-off part of his enclosure. Blobby watched with mild interest as the rabbit hopped around. He crept closer, his body low to the ground. The keepers held their breath. This was it. The moment of truth. Blobby wiggled his hindquarters, just as Jed had described. He launched himself forward and landed a foot to the side of the rabbit, batting at it gently with a sheathed paw. The rabbit startled, froze. Blobby sniffed it, tilted his massive head, and then looked back at the keepers with a quizzical chirp as if to say, "Okay, this toy's a bit boring. What's next?" The rabbit eventually hopped away, completely unharmed. They tried again weeks later with a pheasant. The result was even more comical. Blobby was more interested in the bird's long, iridescent tail feathers than the bird itself. He chased his own tail for a minute, got dizzy, and then took a nap in a patch of sun. It was unequivocally clear. Blobby was non-releasable. The instincts that should have been hardwired into his DNA were simply not there. He was a predator in form, but a pet in function. For Eris, it was a somber conclusion, a confirmation that a wild animal would live its entire life in captivity. But for Maya and the rest of the staff who had fallen in love with him, it was also a secret relief. Blobby was staying. His life at the sanctuary settled into a comfortable, happy routine. He was the official greeter, his enclosure the first one visitors would see. He'd sit by the fence, watching the people with his intelligent eyes, often letting out his signature soft chirps, especially at children. Maya started an Instagram account for him. The adventures of Blobby the Blinks became a local sensation. People were captivated by the photos and videos of the giant cat playing with a cardboard box, getting a belly rub from a keeper, or helping rake leaves by pouncing on the pile. He became an ambassador for his wild cousins, a living, purring example of the wonder of the natural world. He loved his caretakers with a fierce, gentle devotion. He'd rub against their legs through the chain-link fence, his purr a deafening rumble of contentment. He'd allow Aris to check his teeth and ears without the slightest protest. His favorite moments were his play sessions with Maya, chasing the feather wand with the boundless joy of a creature who didn't have a care in the world. He was safe, he was loved, and he was happy. One crisp autumn day, a year after he'd brought Ruckus to the sanctuary, Jed Stone's old pickup truck pulled into the visitor parking lot. He was slower now, leaning a bit more heavily on his cane, but his eyes were sharp. He'd followed Blobby's progress on the sanctuary's website, his heart swelling with a strange, distant pride. He had to see him. Eris met him at the gate. "Jed, it's good to see you." "Came to see the boy," Jed said, his voice gruff. Eris led him to the enclosure. Blobby was dozing in the sun, a magnificent 88-pound pile of spotted fur. He looked bigger, healthier, his coat gleaming. "Blobby," Eris called softly. The giant cat's ears twitched. He lifted his massive head and his eyes fell on Aris. Then he saw the man standing next to him. His posture changed instantly. He got to his feet and padded directly to the fence, his eyes locked on Jed. He let out a series of low, excited chirps, a sound Jed hadn't heard in a year. Jed approached the fence, his hand trembling slightly as he reached out. "Hey there, Ruckus," he whispered. Blobby pushed his head hard against the chain link, straining to get closer. He began to purr, that deep engine rumble that Jed remembered so well. It was a sound of pure recognition, of pure, unadulterated love. He rubbed his face back and forth against the wire, trying to get the scent of the man who had saved him, the man who had been his whole world in a tiny cabin in the woods. Jed stood there for a long time, his fingers resting on the fence, tears streaming freely down his weathered cheeks. He wasn't crying from sadness, but from a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. The big fellow was okay. He was more than okay. He was home. Watching them, Eris felt a familiar warmth spread through his chest. Blobby was a paradox. He was a creature of immense power who would never hunt, a wild animal who craved a belly rub, a genetic anomaly who had found his place not in the deep woods, but in the hearts of the people who cared for him. He was a living reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary strength is found not in tooth and claw, but in a gentle spirit and a heart big enough to bridge the gap between two worlds. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the sanctuary. Blobby, his purr finally subsiding to a soft rumble, settled back down, his eyes still on Jed. He was a giant, a myth, a legend. But in the end, he was just what Jed had seen on that cold April day. A creature who wanted to be safe, to be warm, and to be loved. And in this small corner of the Minnesota North Woods, he had found it all.